Hi, this is Mike Young with Noble Warriors. You're about to hear a message entitled, Is Intelligent Design an Intelligent Decision? Presented by Joe Thompson, a member of the Noble Warriors team from Chesterfield, Virginia. This workshop was part of the Iron Sharpens Iron Men's Conference hosted by Noble Warriors at Grace Church of Fredericksburg on Saturday, March 10th, 2012. I pray the message will challenge and encourage you as you walk with Christ and lead your family.
What you're about to see is a kind of a condensed version from a 20-hour class that we led for our church. So you're going to see about 5%. Okay, so but I think it's enough to give you some ammunition to go with. You've got a card there. I'll do this seminar anywhere, anyplace, anytime. We use it as an outreach to a number of different, as an outreach in your church. We'll do this to the youth group. We'll do it to a Christian school, class, anything you want. But I just hope you enjoy it here. So here we go. First of all, I want to take no credit for what's here. There's a lot of organizations out there that can, that is available to you if you want to use them. This is not particularly any one source. I'm using a lot of what's from the creation science evangelism. So why do we do this? I think 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. That's why we do this, so that you guys can go out there and be prepared. So, is intelligent design an intelligent decision? We're going to talk today a little bit about, is it creation, is it evolution, or some combination thereof, either progressive creation or theistic evolution. Maybe like, did God wind it up and let it go? That's another way of thinking about that. Some people want to go that way. Well, we'll take a look. And our clicker is going to give us a problem, I think. Evolutionists would like you to think the debate is over, that you're the only moron left in the world who believes in something other than evolution. But here's a recent, I won't say not all that recent, but a Washington Times headline said 55% of U.S. natural scientists believe in Darwinian evolution. Notice what that thing didn't say, that 45% of U.S. natural scientists don't believe in evolution. If I were to bring, let's just say, 10 scientists in this room and ask the guys who believed in evolution to go over here and those who didn't believe to go over here, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So how can it be that half of the U.S. scientists are missing the page here? This is out of Science Digest. It's not a Christian magazine. It says scientists who utterly reject evolution may be one of the fastest growing controversial minorities out there. This is not preachers versus scientists. That's what I want you to take away from here. I love Dilbert. It's just one of my favorites. I'll read that to you. It says, wow, you have 3 master's degree and a PhD. Yes, it's all very impressive, but interestingly, I have no common sense whatsoever. And I said, that's not the kind of thing that you ought to say in an interview. He said, I don't see why not. I spent 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry. I work for Abbott Laboratories. I know some very, very intelligent people who believe in evolution. I also know some very, very intelligent people who've never asked the question, why? Have they ever looked at the evidence for evolution? So there's a lot of people out there. You're going to hear some very intelligent people making some very silly statements, and you're going to ask yourself, do I not have any common sense at all? So let's, you don't have to be a PhD to understand the evidence. We're going to have trouble with it. And I'm just going to go by this. I'm going to skip that just because we're going to be a little short on time here, and we're just having trouble with the clicker. And I don't know. So what is truth? If I were to give you this right here and ask you what that is, what would you tell me?
It's an orange.
Yeah. It's a banana, right? Well, why do you think that's a banana? Why would you say that? Anything that looks like that, has that shape, has that color, has that contour, has that texture, is a banana, right? We know that. Now that may seem overly simplified to us, but that's God. We can count on God every time. Now, what if you opened it up? What would you expect to find? A potato? An orange?
I don't want that to happen.
No matter how much you want something different, I really, 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 really don't want it to be a banana. Does that make any difference? No. You can't change God's truth, right? God's truth. God doesn't jerk us around and have gravity on some days and not on other days. He doesn't have photosynthesis work today and not tomorrow. That's God. God is the ultimate truth. But what about man? Is the guy who's standing over there with the $5,000 Armani suit, is he rich? Awesome. Maybe. He might be. but he also might not be, right? Why do we have 1 million Americans a year declaring bankruptcy? Because we want people to think we're rich. We want to give that air. Can you count on man? Not necessarily. I think the ultimate source of truth is God. Now, an interesting thing that Jesus says in the Bible, you ever notice how he talks? Why did he come into the world? To testify to the truth. Isn't that kind of an interesting statement? Jesus said, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth, in John 18. In fact, Jesus talked a little funny sometimes if you think about it. He started many of his sentences with, I tell you the truth. In fact, he's done it over 100 times in the Gospels. Who said, though, come on, we're going to run out of time with this. If you tell a lie long enough, loud enough, and often enough, the people will believe you. Adolf Hitler. He also said people are more likely to believe a big lie than a small one. Now, how do you do this, though? If you mix in a little bit of truth with the lie, people will get so confused on trying to sort out what's fact, what's fiction, that they can spend years lost in this maze. In Colossians 2:24, Christ himself said, I say this in order that no one may delude you with persuasive argument. Now, creationists would say that in the beginning, God, maybe about 6,000 or so years ago. Evolutionists would say in the beginning, nothing. Maybe 20 billion years ago, there was a big bang from nothing, and therefore it's where it all started. Well, let's take a look at how that really works. What is the one thing Darwin did not talk about in his book, The Origin of Species?
The origin of the universe.
He didn't talk about the origin of any species. Kind of deceiving title, but he really didn't talk about the origin of any species. And the reason that he didn't was because he doesn't know anything about that. He didn't have any clue. He thought the cell was just a blob of protoplasm and really didn't, like more like Jell-O, and didn't really understand anything about it. It's not his fault because he didn't know at that time. But evolution is like a shell game with a problem. There really is no P under any of them. Now I'll tell you why. It's the biologist thinks that the astrophysicist has the answer, and the astrophysicist thinks the geologist, and the geologist thinks the anthropologist, and everybody thinks everybody else has the absolute evidence. But in the end, nobody really has the evidence. We've been taught for decades by some very highly acclaimed scientists that evolution is a fact. And it's been taught in our schools for over 50 years now because the government sanctions that. The question really is that it is not working. Do the facts really support the position? Now, you guys probably know who this is. This is Carl Sagan. This is the guy that said billions and billions of years in the cosmos is where he got his fame. But he's basically the evolutionist mouthpiece in the 1980s. Now, Carl said in one of his books, evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contextual molecular biology. Anybody see what Carl just did? Carl's field of expertise is the cosmos, right? But astrology, yet he's saying he's referring to someone else's area of expertise for the evidence. Now, why, if he's so sure of it, why didn't he give his evidence from his area field of expertise? Well, let's take a look. We're going to follow this. We'll go for the look. Let's look at what Carl said. Let's just take a look at some of the latest scientific information, DNA. Now, DNA is one of the most complex molecules in the universe. If I were to take down and write down the code in DNA and put it in a book, and I took that book and filled it up, threw it out into the Grand Canyon, I would fill the Grand Canyon before I'd written out all the code on DNA. Now, the probability of just one DNA arranging itself by chance has been calculated at one chance in 119,000 times 10 to the 119,000. Now, I have trouble comprehending that number because I'm just an engineer. I don't work with numbers like that very often. To give you some idea of the scale, that the entire visible universe of what we've been able to see is 10 to the 28 inches in diameter. When they say that life evolved by chance, it's just not an intelligent statement. And they're telling us our creation story is not intelligent. Well, here's a guy, a very famous guy, not necessarily a Christian, said nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. Here's a guy from a professor in Canada. I like him, at least he's honest. He said, since science has not the vaguest idea of how life originated on Earth, it would at least be honest to admit it to the students, to the agencies funding research, and the public. Now, if all it takes to create life is to have all the right molecules, all the right proteins, all the right enzymes in the right place at the right time, why not just put a frog in a blender? Maybe not the most appetizing thought, but what's the difference if I put a frog in a blender, turn the blender on, and I've got this green goo? Aren't all the right molecules, proteins, enzymes in the right place at the right time? How long will it take for that to become a frog? What's the difference? What's the difference between that green goo and the frog hopping around in your backyard? It's called the breath of life that our Creator gave us, right? Genesis 7 says all creatures have the breath of life in them. Genesis 2 says, Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. You take the breath of life away, and we're dead, right? From conception until birth, the human body adds about 15,000 cells per minute, and each one of those is more complex than a space shuttle. By chance? Is that an intelligent statement? Now, this is another guy who's kind of stepped into the forefront. He said, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede spontaneous generation. That's what we're talking about, is chemicals forming themselves into an organic cell, is impossible. Now, this is an evolutionist. Yet here we are as a result, I believe in spontaneous generation. Here's one of those very intelligent guys that makes a very off-the-wall kind of statement. He also said that the only other choice is to believe in special creation, i.e. God, and that's impossible. We can't do that. Now, is that science or is that religion? Can I have, Paul, would you get them to get me a different remote? This is not working very well. So if you'd ask Todd to get me another one, I appreciate it. Okay. Now, this is the same guy saying, yeah, unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, they're left with nothing. I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through the hypothesis of spontaneous generation. Now, is that really science or is that religion? I think I want you to walk away from here. It's not science versus religion. It's religion versus religion. Just a different religion than what you're thinking. This little cartoon says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2 where it says, then a miracle occurs. Because every scientist has to postulate this problem. And every scientist does, unless they stick their head in the sand. God created every living creature that moved along with that. Now, the question is, does your Bible talk about the creation-evolution debate? And the answer is, you know the Bible talks about everything. In Jeremiah 2, it says, who says to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave me birth? James 3:12, can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives? Or a vine produce figs? Neither can salt water produce fresh water. It's been there for 2,000 years, guys. We just don't know our Bibles. Come on. Now, well, I think what evolutionists would like us to think that this, we kind of metamorphosize into who we are. Now, this is not really going to go very well if I don't get this clicker to work, but this is kind of how they want us to believe the evolutionary process takes place. Now, I really don't need a lot of emails about this. We're just poking a little fun. But if you believe, now here's National Geographic says the first pioneer. If you believe that, someone's trying to make a monkey out of you. Okay? A conservative estimate suggests that it takes 50,000 metamorphical logical changes to go from one species to another. And this is not, by the way, this is not a calculation by a creationist. We've got 2 of the members, the start and the end. Question is, where are the other 49,998 members of the species? We've not seen any of them. Natural selection selects from existing options. It cannot generate anything new. It can't add wings to a dog. It can't put gills on a cat. Okay? It selects from what's already there. If evolution is true, it only seems logical that the more chromosomes that you have, the more developed, the more evolved you become. Since penicillin's only got 2 chromosomes, well then a fruit fly's got 8, that's okay, and then a tomato's got 12. I thought a fruit fly at least had to fly around. I don't know, this doesn't seem to be working real well. Housefly and a tomato are the same. A possum, a redwood, and a kidney bean. Maybe that explains why we got so many dead possums on the road. I don't know about that. Here is, humans have 46 and tobacco's got 48. You're not as smart as that cigarette you're smoking, I guess. I don't know, it's involved. This just doesn't seem to be going the direction that evolutionists would like. I have some ferns and they're not as smart as my kids. Sometimes, maybe. If amphibians evolved before mammals, why do some amphibians have 5 times more DNA than mammals, and some amoebas have 1,000 times more DNA? Could you get me a different remote? This is not working. It's kind of persnickety. Now, in the DNA discovery and research, we found some things that I don't think that evolutionists really wanted you to hear, but it said that virtually all men, 99% of them can be traced back to one individual, and they named him Y chromosome Adam. But they go back very recently to one ancestor. This is in the U.S. News report. That doesn't surprise me, I guess, because that's what the Bible said all along. Everyone in the world descended from a single person who lived around 3,500 years ago. Huh. Anybody know who that was? Noah, probably, or Adam. Now, there's another marker out there called, we'll just skip that because it's a female marker. It's called mitochondria. And it said at that rate, Eve lived about 6,500 years ago, a figure clearly incompatible with our current origins, human origins. Well, that's not compatible with what? Come on. Z, can you do something? It's not out of line with what the figures that I had. It may be out of line with what they're talking about, but not what I thought. Man evolved 3 million years ago, according to the evolutionary theory. Now, Francis Crick was the co-inventor of discovering the DNA, and he said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why do I have to continue to tell myself this is not designed, this is not designed, this is not designed? Because it looks designed. But I got to tell you, no, it's not designed, it's evolved. Is that one very intelligent individual who's asking some very silly questions? Now, Carl said, evolution is a fact based on contemporary molecular biology. That's just not a true statement, Carl. Let's look at the fossil record. Before we do, God did not give Adam and Eve a bag of seeds, a couple of babies, and tell them to get to work. They were fully formed, mature, and the world that they were created in was fully formed and mature. So, there's something critically important to understand. Here's another evolutionist says, to understand the debate. Time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible, probable. And the probable, virtually certain. See how they made that jump? One only has to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Without massive amounts of time, meaning billions of years, evolution has no hope. They've got to protect this secret to the nth degree, or they don't have a prayer. So how old is the Earth? Evolutionists would want you to believe that the Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. 4.56 if you want to be exact, because scientists like to do that, which is kind of silly. But let's just say, for instance, that we are deep sea fairgoers, and we're trying to find our treasure. And we finally find our booty on the bottom of the ocean floor, and we want to determine what ship it was on. And we find in there, we've got a coin from 1750, one from 1710, and one from 1695. The question is, when did the boat sink? We can't necessarily say when exactly it did sink, but I can tell you when it did not sink, right? It did not sink before 1750, right? Now, this may sound kind of crazy, but it's kind of critically important that we understand this feature, and the question is, why would that be? Well, if just one young Earth hypothesis is true, then the Earth cannot be any older than that date. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take a look. Textbooks say the Earth is billions of years old, but not always. In 1770, it was about 70,000 years old. In 1905, it was 2 billion. In 1969, it went to 3.5 billion. And now this is one of your kids' textbooks that says, stress that the Earth is thought to be 4.5 billion years old. Why do you need to stress that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? If it's there, it ought to be obvious. Why should they tell teachers what they need to stress? It's interesting that science textbooks have been revised every couple of years. You think about that as we come up with something new, we've got to revise the textbooks. That's been happening ever since the Gutenberg Press. How often do we have to revise the Bible? Now, how did we get to this point where we think the Earth is more than a couple thousand years old? Well, a guy named Charles Lyell came out in the 1830s with a series of books that thought that if the stratification of the layers of the rock must mean that the Earth must have been laid down there very slowly, one at a time. And actually, Darwin was a fan of his. But from this, it's been theorized that the fossils that they contain must be millions of years different in age, and that these fossils must represent some kind of sorting and represent evolution. This would say that they came up with these layers of rock, and then they gave them names, and you may recognize Jurassic from some of the other ones, a couple of them, the Cambrian. And then they dated them at 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, 400 million, whatever. Now, they want you to assume that this is the way a fossil is created, that like a dinosaur dies in a lake, and I don't know why he went and died in the lake, but he dies in the lake, falls to the bottom, some silt covers him over, then the lake dries up, and the wind blows some of the stuff away, and we find a dinosaur. Now, is that the way a fossil would form today, by the way? No. If a deer dies in the wood, are we going to have him fossilized? No, there's probably some other animal's going to come around and take a bite out of him and go have lunch somewhere, and they'll be spread all over the place, right? Why don't we get that happening today? But evolutionists would say we come up with this geological time scale called the geological column, that if we do look at this is a statement made, the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks much more accurate. Anybody understand that? It's called circular reasoning. The rocks date the fossils, but I date the rocks, but that's just going around in a circle. Now, you'll see where that comes back to play a little longer. Thomas Jefferson said way back in 1787, the moment a person forms a theory, in his imagination he sees in every object only the traits which favor that object. So I make a theory, then I see everything that relates me back into this same theory. Now, this is the curator for the American Museum of Natural History, a guy who works with fossils all the time. He says, the patterns we perceive are as likely a result as from our unconscious mindsets as they are from evidence itself. Not, by the way, a creation. Richard Leakey, whose dad was the famous Louis Leakey, said his dad had a tendency to arrange the fossils in order their criteria to fit in a line of human descent. Now, this works a little bit. If I'm buried above a teddy bear, that must mean that I descended from a teddy bear. And this is a bunch of hoo-ha, guys. I got to tell you honestly, what happens is they will date something, and then they'll start digging, and they'll find something else, and it's not in line. Then they say, oh, man, that 15 million year old skull, that was wrong. It's now only 3 million, because we found something older than it down below. The geological column, why do we sort birds and amphibians and clams and everything else? There's some reasons why we do this, and there have been some tests on this. They threw all these different types of things into a slurry and let it settle out, and guess how they settle out? Just like if it was in a giant bathtub of water, a flood. So the fossils aren't nearly as well sorted as we have a tendency to think, and we even creationists have a tendency to think that there's a better ranking here of these things than there really is. Now, the classic example we would give would be the Grand Canyon. Look at that stratification. Isn't that magnificent how all those layers, it gets older and older and older and older as we get out, right? Well, that works okay, but then how would they explain this? This is a road cut through West Virginia. I used to drive this way to Virginia Tech from my home when I was going to school there. See the little car down there? Now all of those layers had to be soft at the same time in order for them to deform. Because why? Kindergartners tell me solid rocks don't bend, right? Anybody ever try to bend a rock? They don't bend, they break, right? How do you bend rocks like that? They all had to be soft and malleable at one time, at the same time. Can you bend a rock like that? Can anybody bend a rock like that? Not when after they're settled in and hard, right? So you want to tell me all those rock layers are all different ages? It works nice when I got them all nice and straight. Anybody ever seen one of these little toy? You put sand or sediment in between a couple of liquid and a couple of pieces of glass, you turn the glass over and then it settles out nice and neat. This is one thing, it takes a couple of seconds, maybe a minute. That's the same stuff turned over the next time. Do I have to be a rocket scientist or a geologist to figure out that all happened in a matter of seconds? And what would explain a tree growing through a couple 100,000 or a million-year-old rock? It's called, is it really 400 million years old that a tree stood up there for 400 million years and didn't rot and didn't decay and just kind of sat there and waited till all these sediment came in? Is that real life, guys? These are called polystrate trees. We find them all over the world, okay? Here's an example of a fish that ended up getting buried vertically. The head of the fish was in 1 year dated rock. The other rock was a couple 100,000 years older. The fish just kind of stayed like that until those rocks sediment settled out, right? Okay, I got some land in Florida. Here's a petrified tree where the top layer of the tree is in one coal seam and the bottom's in another one. They're dated thousands of years apart. Does that make sense? Is that what they want us to believe, is that those are thousands of years apart and that tree did not decay for thousands of years while it waited? So notice where man fits into this chart. Basically in the last 100,000 years, okay? Man doesn't evolve onto the scene until the last couple hundred years. Richard Dawkins, who is today's mouthpiece for evolution, said, if a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in a 500 million year old rock, our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. I didn't say this. This is the mouthpiece for evolution. Well, remember, here's humans up at the top, and here's where we found human artifacts in the rock record. Now that bottom one down there says 600 million year old rock. How can this be? Now, you probably can't read that, but this is just showing where some of the human beings' artifacts have been found in the rock record, whether it's a gold necklace, a rock clump, a skull, bones. Here is a human handprint darted in 110 million year old rock. That is so detailed you can actually see the fingernails in that rock. Here's another human hand in a 100-year-old rock. Oh, well, okay. Here's a footprint in 100 million year old rock. Now, this little tiny circular thing in there, it's called a trilobite. That's one of the oldest living or known forms of life in the earth. It's supposed to be 500 million years ago. Yet there was a man who was developed enough to stand up on 2 feet and put sandals on. How long has man been wearing sandals in the evolutionary time frame? That he would have been around back 500 million years ago. Just another example where it should never have been found. Here's a hammer in 400 million year old rock. Here is a silver vessel, 600 million year old rock. Now coal is supposed to take millions and millions and millions of years to form. Here is a iron pot found in a lump of coal in a coal plant in Oklahoma. Here's a waiter's bell found in a lump of coal. Oil, supposed to take millions of years. Australia spent $20 million turning sewage into sludge into oil in about 30 minutes. Here's the turkey guts. I used to work in a poultry industry when I got out of college. turning 4 billion barrels of light Texas crude out of turkey guts. Here's what the president of the company said: we do what Mother Nature took millions of years to do in about 30 minutes.
You can do it.
How about petrified wood? Millions of years to petrify wood, right? Here's a piece of chopped wood. Chopped by who? I don't know. Pterodactyl, maybe. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the legs still in it. If you turn the boot over, it says 1950. Here's a petrified pickle. We found petrified teddy bears, petrified acorns, petrified peanuts. If you've ever been to Luray Caverns, not too far from here, they tell you it took millions and millions and millions of years to do it. My wife went to here on our honeymoon. We went to Carlsbad. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in the Lincoln Memorial, but it was, if you get out in the basement of that, they find, it was built in 1922, and we find a 50-inch stalactite on a 40-year-old building. In 1960s is when that was found. Here's a TP fountain in 1900. Here's the same fountain 100 years later. That's a 6-foot tall man standing there. How about erosion? Another way to date the Earth. If the current erosion rate of the continents were to erode flat in 14 million years, that's where we would be right now. How can we have rocks 300 times older than that still above the sea level? And what about all the sediment that get carried away? Wouldn't that build a mountain under the mouth of the river? The Mississippi runs about 80,000 tons of sediment down it every hour. There's not enough sediment at the mouth of the Mississippi, but for about 30,000 years, most. Another good way to date the Earth is a waterfall, is a grate. It erodes backward. All waterfalls erode backward. So if we look at the Niagara Falls, looking back over the years, you can see up there where the Niagara Falls used to be in 1764, then 1819, then 1847. You can track it back. Pretty quickly, you can say, well, okay, it erodes about almost 5 feet a year. Well, if I look at a map and it's millions of years old, why is Niagara Falls only eroded about 8 miles? Because when the Niagara Falls actually erodes all the way, you're going to drain all the Great Lakes. When it erodes back there to the, back up here, I don't know whether I got a pointer on this yet. When it erodes all the way to there, it will drain the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes cannot be any older than 10,000 years old. Salinity of the ocean, it could have gone from fresh water to 3.6% salt in less than 5,000 years. How about a reef, coral reef? Off the coast of Australia during World War II, a lot of bombs dropped, a lot of planes crashed, a lot of ships wrecked. The Australian government went out to look at the Great Barrier Reef and all the damage that was done to that. So they conducted a government study, just watched it for 20 years. You know, typical government watching for 20 years. What they found was that the Great Barrier Reef was less than 4,200 years old. How about some of the oldest trees on Earth? Why are they only 4,300 years old? The oldest living organisms on the planet are only 4,300 years old. How about major writing systems? We look at what is written. It's interesting. World Book Encyclopedia said the first developed systems of word writing appeared about 5,000 years ago. And the oldest language that can be reasonably reconstructed is already modern, sophisticated, complete from an evolutionary standpoint. Why would that be? Wouldn't we expect language to evolve just like everything else evolved? Why do we have a hard start for language? Chinese calendar was about 4,700 in the year 2000. Interesting. Maybe they started with the birth of Shem and Noah. Hebrew calendar was about 5760 in the year 2000. The Saxons in England have genealogy that go all the way back to Adam. The Danes go back to Noah. If you want to read more about it, you can get a book called After the Flood. Interesting. Last week's population, this is from last year, 2011. The world's population hit 7 billion. Now, if we were to trace this backward, basically, we know what the birth rate is. If you just trace things backward, you can kind of see what the population should have been. Tracing it backward at about a 0.5% growth, the result's going to be about a handful of people alive 4,500 years ago. Now, that creates a bottleneck. Right here about the time somebody called Noah was supposedly on the scene. That's a problem for the evolutionists. Because if I turn this around and go the other way, let's just say a monkey stood up and we called him a man and he had a wife the same age. If they stood up and they were progressing at the same rate they were talking about, we should have a population about, I can't even tell you what that number is. It's 10 followed by 43 zeros. I know I'm an engineer, but I cannot do the math. So there's a problem there, right? We have a problem. The evolutionists know that. So what do? They create a catastrophe. Now, the catastrophe would make Mount St. Helens eruption look like a pop gun. They said 70,000 years ago, it reduced the population to a few thousand. Now, why do you have to make up a catastrophe when we already know there was one? Because we didn't like the one we had, I guess, right? But they know there's a problem with the population. They just made up a different catastrophe, put it a few years beyond that so they don't have to talk about it. Now, if I were to talk about just flood legends, I mean, there was a thing that was called the flood, right? The catastrophe was the flood. Now, there are 270 flood legends, stories, from different cultures around the world. Forget everything else. 270 flood legends of different cultures, different people. Doesn't that make you want to just think about why would that be? Why would we have 270 different legends from people from around the world, different cultures, different customs, different things, all have the same legend? Here's just a couple from Hawaii. Kunihana, the first man, his name was Nu'u. There was one good man left named Nu'u. Sounds a little bit like Noah, but made a great canoe with a house in it, filled it with animals. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. China called Fuhi, the father of their civilization. Fuhi, his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters. Interestingly, 3 sons, 3 daughters. Escaped the Great Flood. When they lived, they were supposed to repopulate the world. Toltec Indians down in Mexico, and I actually had a plant in this Tlalpan. I actually had a physical plant that I worked at down here. That's why it's a little special interest to me. Talks about a great chest, men began to multiply, a great tower, languages became confused. Very, very similar story. They said that the first world lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by a great flood that covered the highest mountains. Only one man survived, named Coctox. Now, interestingly, the Bible dates that put the flood at 1,656 years after the creation. The Toltec Indians are only off 60 years after over 4,000 years. Interesting. We've actually got archaeological evidence from Gilgamesh. You guys may be familiar with that. The geological evidence for the flood is plenty. We're not going to go through all of these. I'll touch a little bit on some of them, but I just want to, anybody that's walked down the beach in Virginia Beach or on the Outer Banks knows that clams open when they die, right? Not a brainstorm, that's just the way, what happens, that's the way the clams die. Why would we find 30 feet thick of unopened clams in stacks 30 feet thick on the top of Mount Everest? Or on top of some of the highest mountains in the world? Here's an oyster 11 and a half feet wide, 2 miles above sea level. What's the evolutionist take on that? Now, we find massive graveyards all over the world. I mean massive, almost a trillion with a T, trillion fossils in some of these graveyards. Well, why would animals all know this is where I'm supposed to go to die? A trillion animals went, like, crawler is out, time to go. I'm going to go lay down in this big, happy hunting ground. Why? Isn't that better explained by some other things that we know about how a flood carries everything, transports it millions, or not millions, thousands of miles, and deposits all in one area? These graveyards are all over the world. They're in North America, Europe, Australia. Things were buried so rapidly that we still see the detail. Here's one with the fins and the eye sockets on a fish. Here's here's a jellyfish. Now, a jellyfish doesn't have any bones, in case you guys didn't know. There's no bones but goo there. Why would that fossilize? It had to be buried very, very rapidly. Here's one caught in the act, eating another fish. Here's another one caught in the act, giving birth. These things were buried extremely rapidly. That's the only way you create a fossil, is by before the organism has a chance to decay. Now, the Grand Canyon, we've talked about that before, I think is a better evidence for a flood than slow erosion. Now, why would I say that? Well, I think the snow line tells the story. Grand Canyon is a breach in a giant dam. And why would I say that? Guys, where does snow fall first? In the mountains, right? Here's a satellite photograph of the Grand Canyon. You see where the snow is? That's a mountain. It's called a Kabib lift, okay? Now, the Colorado River enters there at about 2,800 feet elevation, travels about 270 miles, and then exits the Grand Canyon about 1,800 feet above elevation. Anybody know a river that flows uphill? Anybody been to the Grand Canyon? You do this yourself. Go onto Google Earth, Google up the Grand Canyon, go over and click on the topographically, all right? And it'll tell you what the elevation is. You'll see that this is about 7,000 to 8,000 feet, and you're standing on the south rim. It's about 6,800 feet. The north rim is about 8,800 feet. The river does not come in there until then. In profile, how did that river, Colorado River, run up that hill to erode that mountain? It didn't. If I were to take and dam up the river at Glen Canyon Dam, right about where it comes into Arizona from Utah, the water that was created behind it would cover 4 states, about the size of the Great Lakes, okay? And when that dam burst, it creates some tremendous damage. Now, we know this for a fact because Glen Canyon Dam was actually built in about that spot. And in 1983, it had a big snowfall, lots of water there, and they had to open up the gates to keep it from overflowing the dam, destroying the dam. That's what's kind of right down here. You see this water just pouring out of there. And they opened up these gates, and they just heard this tremendous roar and thunder. Only a couple seconds later, they said, shut it down, I don't know what's going on, but it's tearing up something. Here's what happened in a matter of seconds. Cavitation. Now there's right up there is where that tube was you're talking about. That's 35 feet of solid rock in a matter of 20 seconds or so.
Huh.
Now, let me see if we can go back here. Mount St. Helens in 1980, same thing happened. As the mountain blew, it blew trees and logs, and they started damming up the rivers, and they started backing up until they blew. This is a 150-foot drop here, done in a matter of minutes, not millions and millions of years. We'll quickly touch a little bit on radiometric dating, just because I know you've heard C4, carbon-14, and some things about that. If you look at a periodic table, carbon and nitrogen are side by side there. If we look at them closely, if I could just flick a proton out of that nitrogen, I would get carbon-14. And that's really what happens. As cosmic rays kind of bombard the Earth, they hit the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and we just flick basically a proton out of that nitrogen atom and create carbon-14. Here's kind of what it looks like in profile. We just had a big solar wind here the last couple of days. We probably created a little more excess C14. As the sun strikes the Earth's magnetic field, it knocks out a couple of these things, and this is what creates carbon-14. Now, carbon-14 then matches up with oxygen to make CO2. All right, so if I break this down a little bit, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.06% carbon dioxide, which is a tiny fraction of that, is carbon-14. Now, during photosynthesis, plants breathe in this CO2, make it part of their tissue. Animals then eat the plants, take it into their tissue. Now, when the plant or animal dies, it goes out of balance with whatever else is going on in nature, and this is what we're measuring the difference. This is how C14 carbon dating works. Now, whatever C14 remains, it decays at a half-life of about 5,700 years. And since it gaining more, it goes out of balance. That's what we're trying to measure. Now, 0 years, and in 5,000 years, it'll be half that, and another 5,700 years will be half that, and it goes down. You can see that we're going to, over a period of maybe 40 or 50,000 years, all of the C14 should be gone. All right? If I took a chunk of carbon-14 the size of the Earth, the half-life, in about 1 million years, you wouldn't be able to detect anything in the Earth 1 million years later. Yet, carbon-14 dating for it to work, the amount of C14 has always been the same. That's an assumption we talked about earlier. Well, it's been calculated it would take at least 30 years for the Earth's equilibrium to, or atmosphere to reach equilibrium, so we know the Earth is millions of years old, so we don't have to worry about that, right? Right? So we can ignore the equilibrium problem. The problem is it isn't in equilibrium yet. And if it's not in equilibrium, all bets are off. Radiocarbon-14, or radiocarbon is forming about 30% faster than it's decaying right now. Well, that just, if you don't have equilibrium, you can't measure anything because you don't know where it's going and coming from, right? So where would that show itself? The lower leg of a woolly mammoth was dated at 15,000 radiocarbon years, while the skin on the same animal is 21. This was done in 1949. They noticed a problem here. A living mollusk was dated at 2,300 years old. A little bit of a problem because he's still alive. This was a problem in 1963. There was a freshly killed seal was dated 1,300 years old. That was in 1971. We haven't solved this problem yet, guys. We're still struggling with this. Finally, the guys came clean and said, if C14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict it, we put it in a footnote. And if it's just completely out of date, we just drop it. Now the question is, completely out of date with what? Well, it's completely out of date with what I know from the geological column, because this fossil was found there, so it has to be that old. Now, here's a couple Russian scientists found a dinosaur bone that was only 30,000 years old. Another guy found a dinosaur bone that was only 20,000 years old. Now, how can that be? Well, we didn't tell them there were dinosaur bones before they started dating. When you tell them this is a dinosaur bone, we immediately go 65 to 250 million years ago. This is where it has to be, so why start from that? That's that assumption we talked about earlier that you don't ever talk about that. No matter how useful it is, radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate results and reliable results. There are gross discrepancies. Chronology is uneven and relative, and accepted dates are actually selected dates. The whole blessed thing is nothing but 13th century alchemy. It all depends on which funny paper you read. That's not a creationist writing that article. That's a scientist. The Earth's magnetic field has declined 10% in the last 150 years, 40% in the last 1,000. It's getting weaker. It cannot be any older than 25,000 max. Max. And carbon dating can't work if it's getting weaker because you don't have equilibrium. Things to consider when you're doing carbon dating. If you know how old the sample is, it doesn't work. If you don't know how old it is, well, then it subsumes that it works. Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Because that's how we date things, guys. We're going around in a circle. Here's a guy that said, ever since the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate way of dating and correlating the rocks which they occur. It all goes back to the same thing. Where was it found in the rock? Scientific evidence shows that the evolution are wrong about the age of the Earth. We just showed you a number of them. So let's try something else here. Maybe we'll, how about the missing link? Because maybe that'll help if we go there. Here's a scientist that said the most misleading phrase the missing link is called because it suggests that only one link is missing. It would be more accurate to say that there's a greater part of the chain is missing so much that there's not really even a chain there at all. Here's Charles Darwin himself. He had his own doubts. He said, the number of intermediate varieties, these missing links we're talking about, which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation, every rock strata, not full of such intermediate links? Geology does not reveal any such finely graded organic chain. This would be the most obvious and gravest objection one could urge against my theory. Don't worry, Chuck, there's plenty of other ones, but that'll be a good start. He also said, here's his reason why he said that it wasn't there. He said the record is extremely imperfect because basically we don't have many fossils. in his time, and he was right. They really don't, okay? So if, we can't find them after we get a significant number of finds, somebody would reject my whole theory. It's probably a good thing to explain. So what do we learn from a fossil? He's maybe dead, but I can tell you everything you need to know, right? This is what scientists are telling us. What can a fossil bone tell us? Who its children are? Well, no. What its spouse looked like? No. What it ate for lunch? No. When it died? No. Where it died? No. How it died? No. That it's dead? Yes. That's really all I can tell you is that it's dead. It doesn't know if it died here and was transported here. We really can't do anything there, right? So if you find a fossil in the dirt, you don't know if it had any kids. You don't know if it produced different kind of kids. You really know, all you know is that it's dead. Okay? So why would evolutionists claim that bones in the dirt can do something that living animals cannot do, which is to produce different kinds? No fossil would ever be allowed in a court of law as evidence. Although they tried in the Scopes monkey trial. Now here's a Nebraska man and his wife, and I always like how his wife looks like him. They didn't find anything about his wife, but we marry somebody we look like, I guess. This was in 1922. Okay? Now, you need to understand that Nebraska man was built scientifically from one tooth. Okay? Now, even the best jigsaw puzzle workers in the world that I know, my wife's one of them, cannot put together that guy from one tooth. All right? You need to understand, though, all the evolutionist fossils would fit on a pool table with room to spare. All the evidence they're claiming would fit on one pool table with room to spare. We need to look a little bit, how do we reconstruct what something looks like based on the bones? Now, I just want you to look down here at the sperm whale. I don't know if you can see it. Here's the skeleton. Now, this is what I would guess, just from that skeleton, what that might look like, but this is what it actually looks like, which is like nothing like what you would project it to look like. All right? This is a recreation, how they reconstruct something. Here they took one skull and they made two different, completely different looking characters out of it. It's completely within the mind of the artist. They gave that same skull to 9 different artists, and they came up with 9 different looking apes. Now, this is what they gave. These 7 bones they gave, and they told somebody that they were a female. First of all, looking at the bones, how you know that's a female, I'm not sure, but they told them it was a female. And this is what you got from 4 different artists. Now, we'll talk quickly about evolutionary theory's Hall of Shame. We don't have time to go into all of this. This is just some of it, and we're going to touch on a few of them. You may have heard of some of these. Ernst Haeckel was a pupil. He just loved Darwin. He came up with Haeckel's embryos. Now, this was in 1874, and within less than 5 years, it was proven that they were faked. This is what they really look like. This is what Haeckel said in his drawings, what they look like. Now, I don't mean to be picky here, but Haeckel's embryo is still in your science book today. Now, it was proved to be a fraud over 100 years ago. What's it still doing in the kid's textbook today? Well, when he was tried by his university, here's what he said. A small percentage of my embryonic drawings were forgeries. Those, namely, which were observed material that I needed to fill in, basically to reconstruct the missing links. Well, that's what he's trying to show you. All right? Now, I should feel utterly condemned were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie under the same charge. That is a pretty damning statement for all the scientists of his time. But it doesn't change that. Remember Nebraska man? Here's the real Nebraska man. It was an extinct pig's tooth.
Huh.
Now, New York Times, 1912, Darwin's theory is proved true. How many times have you heard Darwin's theory has been proved true? This is Piltdown Mountain in 1912. Now, it's interesting. The guy who found Piltdown Mountain was knighted by the King of England for his discovery. This information was used in the Scopes monkey trial as evidence. They wanted this is where they were coming from. The only problem was it was a fraud, an intentional hoax that wasn't discovered for a number of years later. How many lives were destroyed because of this? Here's Lucy. So all you guys are I was in high school when Lucy was discovered. Interesting, I mean, it was the missing link, right? Now, how you get that skull from those parts is another great jigsaw puzzle. Notice one other thing on there. There's no hands and no feet. Okay? She is the transitional form. Here's the St. Louis Zoo with human hands and feet, but there were no human hands or feet found on Lucy, but she's the transitional form. The purpose of the display is not for education, it's for indoctrination. Because why? Here a St. Louis professor, a Washington professor at St. Louis said, the statue is a complete misrepresentation, and I believe they know it is a misrepresentation. Here's the response from the zoo officials have no plan to knuckle under. I put knuckle under in quotes. He's a knuckle walker. We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. We look at the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. How about Neanderthal man? Oh, I gotta love this. Poor guys had sclerosis and everything else. Is this a modern day Neanderthal man, just a hunchback? How about this? Is that what I need? Is that all the evidence that you got? Is the raised eyebrow? Here are some skulls, the Aborigine, European, and a flathead. And it's interesting, the flatheads were well named, I think, in looking at that skull. It was probably appropriate. But look at the eyebrows on the Aborigine. Tell me you've got something more than a raised eyebrow that tells me that this is the missing link. What would you do with this guy? Where would he fit? All right? And what this basically will tell us that God loves this guy as much as he loves me and as much as he loves you. We all need love, but we all come in all shapes and different sizes. And there's no reason in the world that if you found one of those skulls that you would think, oh, it can't be part of the human race. That's just not true. Now, here's one of the world famous professors in Germany. This happened about 5 years ago. I remember this coming out in the newspaper. This guy was one of the world-renowned authorities on carbon-14 dating. Systematically falsified dates on numerous Stone Age fossils. Here, commission found that Professor Prost, over the past 30 years, forged and manipulated scientific facts. He dated a skull that was 3,300 years old at 21,300. Another skull, 27,000, was the guy who actually died in 1750. Wasn't even a couple hundred. Now, here's what they said considering that. We're having to rewrite prehistory because of this screw up. Another guy says anthropology now has to revise its picture of modern man between 40,000 and 10,000. And here's what's really most telling. The university president said a lot of people just look the other way. Now this is not 1874, this is 2007.
Wow.
Now how can one guy cause us to rewrite all of prehistory? Who was forging stuff? We like to use horse evolution. This is actually, you can go to a website, pick Taiwan, pick Spain, you'll take this stuff right off their website today. Horse evolution. Based on what evidence would be my question. If I saw a Shetland pony and a Clydesdale and a donkey and a bronco and all those things in between today, if I had them, if they died today, wouldn't I find them in the earth? They were all there back then. Here, many examples cited the evolution of the horse family. I like this. Unintentionally falsified in 1950. I know it was unintentionally falsified, but that's wrong again in 1951. They haven't corrected it. Oh, it never happened again in 1953. Well, here it is. The much repeated gradual evolution of the modern horse have not held up under close examination, and it's still 1992 now we're still talking about this. If you go today to the University of Yale University in Connecticut, you will see this display still on display. It was proven wrong over half a century ago. How does that happen, guys?
Exit.
Who said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the people? Adolf Hitler. We now have discovered over 1 trillion fossils, and this is another guy out of the Field Museum of Natural History says, 120 years after Darwin, we got 250,000 different species, and we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. I will lay it on the line, there's not one such transitional fossil which could make a watertight argument. This is the evolutionist at the London Museum of History. These are anthropologists, guys, not Christian scientists. Oh, Archaeopteryx. It's just a perching bird. It's nothing more than a bunch of paleobabble. I'm on the wall. Extreme rarity. This is another mouthpiece for evolution. It says, the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and node. The rest is just inference. That's it. Fossil record cannot be considered as anything other than hostile to evolution. There's one thing that evolutionists and creationists agree on, and that is extinction. 99.9% of all species that have ever lived on the earth are now extinct. Nobody argues that fact, right? I mean, creation. But if evolution is true, and we're constantly evolving, where's all the new species? Right? I think we really need to think about this a while. You need to tell the next guy that tries to convince you of evolution, how come 99% of all species ever extinct? Why aren't we generating new species if evolution is still evolving? Which what they say we are. Sorry, Carl, that ain't true either. It's unproved and unprovable. The question is, the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Is that really science? I don't think so. Where do the dinosaurs fit in? We don't got a whole lot of time left, but we're going to try and run through this real quick. See where the humans are on this chart? Very much at the top, last 100,000 years. Dinosaurs, 65 and 250 million years later, right? Just try to keep that in mind as we go along. The term dinosaur means a terrible, great lizard. And reptiles, like all, grow throughout its life. Reptiles grow all their life. Is it possible that dinosaurs are just a reptile that's been growing for a real long time? Doesn't the Bible say that man lived to be 900 years? What if the animals lived 900 years? Could this guy today on the inset there, these are creatures today. What if they just kept growing for a long time? In 1891, the word dinosaur was not in the American dictionary. Why? They hadn't invented it yet. And the term dinosaur didn't come about. Dinosaurs are mentioned throughout all of history, but the name has changed. Anybody know what it used to be? Dragons, serpents, leviathan, behemoths. Since the term dinosaur was not invented until a couple thousand years after the Bible, your translation probably doesn't say dinosaurs in it. But if you get a Bible back in the 1800s, guess what? Dragons are mentioned 34 different times. Whether it's Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Nehemiah, Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah. Interesting, if you look up the word dragon in the dictionary, what is the first definition? Not that they never lived, they're rare. That's the number one definition they're rare. Right? Deuteronomy 32, the wine is the poison of dragons. Job 41, we're going to talk a little bit about this. Sparks of fire leapt out of the Leviathan's mouth. Behold now behemoth. Job 40. This is the whole verse, but I'm going to break it up into pieces here. Behemoth. If you look in your Bible over on the guide, it might tell you it's an elephant or a hippopotamus. Now that is preposterous, and I'm going to show you why. Though the strength is in his loins and the navel of his belly, the force is in the navel of his belly, Job 40:16. Well, I will grant you an elephant has a pretty big belly, and so does a hippopotamus. But so does a dinosaur. So does this guy, and this guy too. But I'm not going to call him a dinosaur, all right? He moves his tail like a cedar, all right? Now, I just happen to have a friend in Lebanon. You read in the Bible about the cedar trees of Lebanon. These are the cedar trees of Lebanon. This is a friend of mine named Sam Basides and his 3 kids. Now look at the size of that tree. This is what Solomon built the temple out of. This is called the tree of the gods, and for good reason. Look at the size of those trees. Now, let's go back and look at that elephant there. Or let's look at not one of these either. Now that's a little more like a cedar. It says his bones are as strong as pieces of brass, like bars of iron. Here's a Bronchiosaurus toe bone. Now here's the leg that goes with that toe bone. Now, which do you think it is? Elephant, hippopotamus, or the Bronchiosaurus, or something else? If your Bible has footnote like this, remember it's the Bible text that it's inspired and not the footnotes. Here's National Geographic. No human being has ever seen a live dinosaur. Now, my question is, does the evidence support that statement? In 900 AD, an Irish writer told of an animal with iron nails on its tail and head similar to a horse. Well, doesn't that match pretty much the Stegosaurus and a couple other dinosaurs we see? Thousands of legends about seeing or killing dragons. Alexander the Great talked about dragons in caves that just petrified his troops when he was in India. Here is an Egyptian tusk. An interesting looking character on that thing. Here's a Greek slate. Now, this is what I call necking. Here's a scroll. Now, how many guys have seen this guy walking around? How about this one from a Babylonian seal? This is the Babylonian entrance gates. It was in Iraq, not too far from Baghdad. It's now in a German museum. But look at the inlay of that. What's on that building? Now here's a U.S. soldier in Iraq. See you in the background. Inca Indians riding a dinosaur. Now, there's also some Ica stones. There's down in Ica, Peru, called the Ica stones, about 11,000 of them found. Let's take a look at some of them. T-Rex. How about this guy? My question is, why would these guys be drawing pictures of things they've never seen? Now, what scientists couldn't figure out was these circular patterns on the skin. Why would they draw these circles on here? And it wasn't until they found a piece of dinosaur skin, a little close-up of it, in 1996. Why would they be doing that? They also had figurines that they carved out of stone, anywhere from 3 inches to 6 feet long. Animals we've never seen. Icarambo, Mexico, another 60,000 of these kind of figurines discovered. How do you carve things you've never seen? Here's an Ica mummy. Now, if we look at her textiles on her, the clothing on her, we look at close up here, I don't know where you can see that there's a blow up of it. Looks like a dragon to me. There's a funky looking guy on a piece of pottery. Now, this is a Cambodian temple. Now we're going to blow up this wall. Sure looks like a Stegosaurus to me, but that's 1,100. That's in this only about less than 1,000 years old. 65 million years ago. How about in the Utah state parks, canyons? Here, we'll put something next to it to give you a little better idea. Carved in the walls. Vikings on the ships. Why would they put carved dragons on their ship heads? The Viking being eaten by a dragon. Here is a Roman era sword with the carving of, you can kind of see it down here a little bit if you see this sword. A dinosaur carved on the sword. Why would people from different parts of the world, different cultures with different backgrounds, draw pictures of carved animals that they had never seen? The question is that reasonable? Would a reasonable man come to that conclusion? I think if one of these guys, if you saw one of these guys, it would make a very deep impression on you. You wouldn't forget. And here's a coin from 1609 showing a man slaying a dragon. Here's one from 1606. You can see the dragon laying on the ground here. I didn't mean to jump by that one so quick for you, but you can see the dragon down here. 1606, 1609, 1620. Sounds like in the 1600s the thing to do is go out and kill a dragon. Here's a Russian medallion, Bulgarian postage stamp. Here's the crest of Lithuania. This is the crest of Lithuania today.
Huh.
Why would the Chinese have 11 real animals and one mythical dragon? In 1271, Marco Polo reported that on special occasion, dragons pulled a royal chariot. That's pretty bizarre, isn't it? It also said in 1611 that they commissioned the position of royal dragon feeder. Why do you need a royal dragon feeder unless there's a dragon to feed?
Is it the government?
There is evidence, yes, that was the government. Evidence of humans and dinosaurs living together have been found in Russia, Brazil, US, Peru. Dinosaurs and human-like footprints have been found both in Turkmenistan and Arizona, and I'm going to show you some from Texas. This is called the Taylor Trail. All right, a little close-up. You can see the dinosaur print going this direction and the human footprint going into it. Here's a human track inside a dinosaur track. Now it's a little closer. You can see the human footprint here and the dinosaur track on the outside. Now, what they've done, let me advance this one more. They took a CAT scan through this one because we wanted to find out really. Let's take a look at the CAT scan here. Here's the human toe which stepped across the dinosaur track here. So it kind of stepped a little bit like that. So they took a CAT scan to see if they had forged it. Somebody like could cut in a human footprint. They're trying to do something. So they took a CAT scan through it to show you that that was not cut in there, but it was actually the impression and the forces on that showed the contours when it wasn't falsified. What are we supposed to do with all this evidence that contradicts evolution? What would a reasonable man do? And join the conversation? Discuss it? Well, here's evolution that says creationists are stupid, lying people who are not to be trusted in any way, and all of their points are equally stupid except for the creationists are outright lying. So another guy, actually where I was actually living for a while, said anyone holding the creationist viewpoint must be illogical, backward, subversive, uneducated, stubborn. I will grant him stubborn for me, please. Here one guy says a professor should have the right to fail any student in his class no matter what the grade record indicates, and then goes so far as to even to retroactively remove those grades and possibly even take their degree if a person espouses creationism after passing a science course in college. Guys, you're going to run into this when you go to school in college. Here's another one, flunk them retroactively. Now, creationists often complain that their theories and their colleagues are discriminated against. As a matter of fact, creationism should be discriminated against because no advocate of such propaganda should be trusted to teach science classes anywhere under any circumstances. If they are right now, they should be dismissed. Guys, this is real, all right? Now, another guy was asked, well, hey, somebody got fired because they were creation. He said, oh, I'm aghast at the suggestion of that. Then he comes on to say, I could not consider myself consider that a teacher had much of a grasp on reality. If she or she believed in creationist viewpoint, there is no point in reviewing the reasoning on both sides. Creationism is a leftover from very primitive folklore. It's real, guys. This one is suggesting that the professional societies should separate them from teaching through exposure and removal as responsibility of the public school system to do likewise. Now, if you don't say anything, it's going to happen, and it is happening, guys. And part of that reason is because we're not saying anything. Here's a guy who said, unless the Christian community becomes involved in the struggle for religious freedom and does so quickly, those that are being born today will be physically persecuted if they desire to practice their faith. I fully understand how radical this statement sounds, but it's an intellectually honest statement, not one to shock. Is this science, is my question, or is it just outright bigotry? All right, I want you to see, this is not about science, it's about religion. If evolution is true, why all the lies and why all the need for intentional deceptions? How does evolution explain the spirit of man? And that's the one thing God said. He put his spirit in us. And why, finally, just why the vicious attacks? If they disagree, that's the scientific fields always disagree with one another. Why such vicious attacks? To the evolutionist, knowledge is king. Science is the ultimate pursuit of learning. But the Bible says we are always learning but never able to acknowledge the truth in 2 Timothy. Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than Christ. Guys, you need to remember this. Romans 1:20 says men are without excuse. We might duck and dodge and stick our head in the sand, but we are without excuse. Their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. They became utter fools. Therefore he gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts, worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. He gave them over to a depraved mind, filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Those who oppose him he must gently instruct, and that's what I'm here today, guys, really, is to just give you some of the instruction, leading them to the knowledge of truth. You got to look at it as the trap of the devil who has taken them captive to do his will. The promise of entering his rest still stands. Let us be careful that none of you are found to fall short of it. The message they heard was of no value because those who heard it did not combine it with faith. Romans 6 says, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life and in Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus said in John 8:24, I told you that you would die in your sins if you do not believe that I am the one I claim to be. You will indeed die in your sins. Your judgment, my judgment day, everybody's judgment day is coming, guys. What will you say?
I trust this message has provided practical encouragement to you in your journey with Christ. Please visit noblewarriors.org to learn more about how Noble Warriors works to help churches reach and build men. God bless you, friend.